everybody. We hope that you're going to enjoy the wonderful program tonight, but I do have a few commercials before we get started. First of all, if you need to take care of yourself, we do have facilities out in the entryway. And also, just so that you know tonight, we really have a special guest, and I'll talk about him in just a minute. But I wanted to highlight a few programs that we have. We've really been trying to emphasize Talbot history and the special place that we all live in this county this month. And I hope that y'all got to celebrate Talbot Day, which was last Friday. But we have saved the best for last here, the best program, the end of April. So we're looking forward to that. But I hope that one of the activities that we had with the county was the Talbot County Bingo. So we do have sheets, and you still can turn these in for prizes. So I wanted to highlight that. And also, tomorrow night, if you have some free time, we encourage you to come to the Friends 50th Anniversary Trivia Night. We are doing this to raise funds for our St. Michael's Library expansion and renovation project. So it's only $20 per person or team. Per person. There's snacks and prizes as well. So we hope that you'll come tomorrow, between 6 and 8 p.m. and join us. You can have a team or play individually. But the trivia is a lot of fun. And we have the Teacher of the Year, Jeremy Hilliard, who will be doing the trivia night. He's our host for the night.
He's very fun.
And then last but not least, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Pete Lesher. So I think that everybody knows Pete. He's a wonderful son in Talbot. But Pete is the chief historian at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, where he has served since 1991. He regularly speaks publicly, making history relevant to varied audiences through the museum's interpretive themes that connect people and place. He is featured in several programs themed on Chesapeake Bay history and culture, produced by Maryland Public Television. And he graduated from Lafayette College. He holds a Master of Arts in History from Columbia University and studied at Mystic Seaport's Munson Institute for American Maritime Studies. His historical research and public history contributions appear in Maryland Historical Magazine, Decoy Magazine, The Northern Mariner, and Sea History, as well as the Chesapeake Log. So we want to welcome Pete Lesher, and I know we're going to learn a lot tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you all for coming out tonight. My job as a historian is not to merely recite facts and figures, but to put them in some sort of framework that tells us who we are, how we got to where we are, and hopefully something relevant for who we are today. Talbot County has recognized April 25th as its birth date. Now, we don't actually know when Talbot County was created. It seems to have been an act sometime early in the year of 1661/2. That's, as you would count it, 1662. But back then they didn't calendar the new year until toward the end of March. So the council at St. Mary's, the provincial council, seems to have recognized the creation of a new county on the Eastern Shore and took several actions that authorized it. But on April 25th of now 1662, the court met for the first time, the first official act of the new county. There was no courthouse. There was no Easton, but there were Lloyds in Talbot County, living on the shore of Wye River, and so they did meet in the home of Edward Lloyd on Wye River, a family that remains there to this day. Well, I'm going to take you back a little bit before that in setting this scene. And my interpretation of Talbot County that I'm going to share with you tonight is how we were really founded or shaped by our proximity to the water and by the delicate intertwining of land and water that gives us so much opportunity for contact with the Chesapeake Bay and with its tributaries. This is what made us who we are, and it continues to shape us today, our relationship with the water. We explored this place by water. It was John Smith in a pair of voyages during the summer of 1608, whose surveys in those voyages resulted in the production of this map, or versions of it, in 1612 and 1613. And as you can see, well, back then north was on the right, not on the top of the map. When you think about it, that's just a convention, isn't it? That we put north at the top. Well, for what it fit on the page better, I guess, this way. So north is at the right. John Smith did it really from having done this in a small open boat, a shallop of the day, produced a remarkably accurate survey. No, you can't overlay a modern chart and say how this lines up, but you do get a very good impression of what he did. What you don't get a good impression of is Talbot County, because they started up on the eastern shore and made their way in their explorations up to probably lower Dorchester County, where they discovered mosquitoes, and they quickly headed to the western shore and explored all the rivers on that side, not hitting the eastern shore again until they got up close to the Sassafras River. And so there's this kind of sketchy morass that shows a series of islands along the eastern shore. Who knows what islands those were picked out to be? Did they pick out Hooper's Island, Poplar Island, Kent Island? There's no way of knowing. There's just not enough detail there. But somehow he skipped over this portion of the bay. He did gather intelligence about what lay beyond the areas that he explored, and he certainly provides names of some of the Native American groups that he encountered on his way. On the lower eastern shore, it's labeled as the Cuscarawaks, and on the upper eastern shore, the Tocquas, and farther north still, as you get up toward Pennsylvania, the Susquehannocks. That last name will be familiar to us. Those lower shore folks were all Algonquin, part of the Algonquin linguistic group. We know them today as the Nanticokes, and there were several sub-tribes of those, the Choptanks, the Osnines, who may have been somewhat in this area, although it seems that there were no large permanent native settlements in what we know today as Talbot County by the time of settlement. This was sort of a no man's land between the Nanticokes to the south, taking shelter behind the Choptank, and the Susquehannocks, who were pushing down from the north. By 1684, we were beginning to see settlement on the eastern shore, and by this time, the first true nautical chart of the Chesapeake Bay, dating to 1684, we can see that the Choptank River is clearly delineated. We get much more definition for this midshore area than John Smith ever offered. And in fact, Charles Calvert, the proprietor of the Maryland colony, took an interest in this area in a series of acts set up establishing places for the lading of trade. Essentially, we want to know what you're putting on the ships and taking off of it so that we can tax it. And so there's this repeated effort by the colony to establish towns. We want to centralize trade in towns because that way we can track the trade and tax it. Without that, though, and really because this was a tobacco economy, there was really no reason to settle in towns. There was no other commerce going out. It made much more sense to have a dispersed population largely along the waterfront, and we'll get to that. Nevertheless, under these acts, and one of them in 1683, the Lords Calvert did establish a town at Oxford as a place for a customs house for the collection of and tracking of trade. Oxford then is really our first town and that first point on the map for Talbot County. Now, if you were getting here and there by water. If the waterways were the highways of the day, you needed some sort of watercraft to get there. And the early explorers of this area, including prior to Jamestown, the settlers of the Roanoke colony, that lost colony, the unsuccessful colony down the boundary into North Carolina, did nevertheless do a lot of documentation of what they observed with the natives, who down there were also the same Algonquin groups, culturally similar to what we had here in the shore. And one of artist John Smith's observations, which got reproduced in Theodore Debris' engraving as you see it published here, shows the making of the boats, the hollowing out of logs when you have a Stone Age culture, more efficiently done by fire, by carefully controlled fire. There's an account of this. Nevertheless, by the time, shortly after settlement, the natives discovered that the European settlers had metal tools, traded for them, continued to make canoes, only much more efficiently, much faster, and as trade goods. This was a product that the English needed. The English did bring a few shipbuilders along with them. Like a lot of the other Jamestown settlers, they didn't survive very long. And so for some small craft, the English settlers relied on the natives producing dugouts, producing canoes. And we have a series of accounts of this. One of those early Talbot County courts in 1663, one settler is suing another over, he didn't pay me for the use of my canoe. What were you lending the canoe for? I was borrowing it so that I was hiring Indians to hunt for me, to go get food. What were they using? A canoe. And in 1681, we have an account. There's a murder, and so there's a trial, and we have the transcript from the trials, and the alibi. They sort of like. Well, we round up the usual suspects, as in Casablanca. And who were the usual suspects? The Indians. So in the transcripts for these trials are the interviews with several Indians. And what was the alibi? We couldn't have committed that murder because we were over here on this other farm making canoes for hire. And variously, they interview in this incident in June of 1881, Iasquiscu, a man of Patuxent who had felled a tree, and two others, Noscom, known as Captain John, and Palpaquinqua, who assisted him in the making of a canoe, variously said by their different accounts to take 8 days or 10 days or a fortnight, 2 weeks. So we get a sense of how long it took with their newfound metal tools, for which they were paid one blue match coat, trade goods. The English had cloth and clothing. The natives were making canoes. Each needed the other's good. Canoes would continue on to be useful small boats, small watercraft for the use of our waterways around here in Talbot County and elsewhere. We get a canoe that is sort of inspired, if you will, by these native dugouts that the oystermen use. Although was it inspired, it's always credited to Native American dugouts, but by this time we also had Africans who also had log building traditions. I would love to know if we can find evidence about the African influence in the creation of the log canoe, in addition to the Native American influence. Log canoes become the tonger's boat as we move into seafood harvesting in the mid-19th century. And by the time this photo is taken, we're moving even beyond that kind of industry to a pleasure boat. This is not an oysterman's boat. This is the log canoe Island Bird, which was never used by an oysterman, was used purely for racing, still is used for racing today. And we can tell that because, one, there's a large crew. They're wearing derbies, and you can see their good taste. They have bow ties. And they're scrambling out over the sides of the boat with springboards, something an oysterman would never do because an oysterman would have the good sense not to put such large sails on his log canoes. These canoes, of course, are made with multiple logs, first 2, then 3, then 5 logs, as we either wanted bigger boats or ran out of the bigger trees to make a bigger boat. And so we put multiple logs together and chopped them down until there was nothing left but what looked like a boat. There's an awful lot of waste in this. A lot of the tree ends up in wood chips. And yet, this was an efficient way of making a boat because material was plentiful and labor was scarce. And if you're not going to make a boat this way, by carving it out of the tree, you're going to saw it, you're going to build it out of planks. And to get planks, you need to saw planks. Well, that is labor intensive. I'll get to that later on. These multi-log canoes we've made canoes in the 21st century for racing. This is one being made for racing in 1931, one that's still around today, the Flying Cloud, as you can see, made of 5 logs. Constructed upside down for the shaping of those logs. The logs are individually shaped before they are joined together. And we still race these today, as you probably well know. In fact, I know we've got at least one log canoe sailor in the crowd here today. That's the reigning champion Island Blossom featured in the center of the photograph. An 1893 log boat. Water continues to shape who we are, continues to shape our culture. Well, besides small boats, Talbot County plays a big role in producing larger vessels, in shipbuilding. Talbot County, as the settlers found it, had ample, good shipbuilding timber, and for a shipbuilder, the supplies that were particularly coveted in Talbot County were yellow pine, loblolly pine as we know it, for the planking of a vessel, and white oak for the framing of the vessel, the keel and the frames and the structural members. Well, this was going on already in the 17th century. We were already producing ships from early on. In fact, in 1697, the council at St. Mary's, the provincial capital, ordered all the sheriffs of Talbot, of the province of Maryland, of the colony of Maryland, to do a survey of shipbuilding. Who's building ships, and how many and what type. And many of the sheriffs anyway turned in reports, and the largest productivity reported at that time, now this is just a snapshot in time because this wasn't an annual survey, just that once in 1697, was Talbot County, reporting 11 yards active in the county, producing ships, brigs, sloops, pinks, and schooners, a total of 39 vessels either under construction or recently constructed. It was an impressive output. Talbot County would continue producing vessel from the timber that was all over this county before we managed to clear it for farmland. By the time of American independence, we were producing a type that we'd already start seeing emerging in the late 19th century up and down the east coast of the United States, the schooner, a fast vessel, good for working to windward, much better for getting down to the islands, coastwise work, getting down to the islands. When you're on the Chesapeake, the islands means the Caribbean. Getting down to the islands and back, because you might have to work up to windward. If you were simply following the trade winds, crossing the Atlantic, in the giant circular trade that we did between Europe, Africa, and the United States, square rig was perfectly fine, and that's what most of the navies had. But in an era after the American Revolution, when French and British navies were preying on American commerce, the British said, if you were English-born, you can't give up English citizenship. And so they would stop an American vessel, find somebody who spoke with an English accent, and say, you're an Englishman, you need to serve in the Royal Navy. Despite the protests that I'm an American, I have an American passport, I have American seaman's papers. And of course, this ultimately leads to the conflict that we know as the War of 1812. But to evade capture like this, and to evade the impressment of American sailors, we built fast ships, ships that could get away from those privateers, ships that could get away from the British and French navies, ships that we came to know later as Baltimore Clippers. Vessels like this, which were built in profusion on the Chesapeake Bay In particular, the name Baltimore Clipper hints at the fact that they were built in Baltimore, or specifically Fells Point. Also Matthews County, Virginia, and also the Eastern Shore, especially Talbot County. We were producing a lot of them. Forgive me for showing you a picture of a Dorchester County built vessel, but they were much the same. This is one that we happen to have a good ship's portrait of. It went to Europe, got painted by a portraitist over in France, and came back. Survived all that. So this actually is one of our best impressions of a locally built Baltimore Clipper with, if you can see all the wonderful detail on the deck, a mixed race crew visible on deck. We were building these vessels in the traditional European method, not log building like we learned from the natives, or was it the Africans, but in the traditional European method of plank on frame, framing up a vessel, laying a keel, putting up frames that look like our ribs, the ribs of a mammal, and then overlaying it with planking, much like we did, as you see here, in the Dove project just a couple of years ago in St. Michael's, the largest vessel built in Talbot County since 1904. Well, after the War of 1812, shipbuilding really tapers off. Peace in Europe, when Napoleon stops fighting and gets sent into exile, peace in Europe is good for Europeans, but it is terrible for Americans. It is terrible for American farmers because the Europeans don't need the grain, American grain, to feed Napoleon's armies. The armies have gone back home and they're growing their own grain. And so there's an agricultural depression in the United States beginning in 1819. Because there's an agricultural depression, we also don't need ships to take that American grain to Europe. And there's therefore a depression in shipbuilding as well. And shipbuilding in Talbot County, in St. Michael's, and elsewhere really declines, with a few exceptions like that of William Hewlett's yard over at Jamaica Point on the Choptank River. He's one that actually gets it going again in those years. St. Michael's declines. St. Michael's was an incorporated town in 1805, 1807. Town government ceased to function. The town depopulated because its raison d'etre, shipbuilding, had ceased and people scattered. St. Michael's would get reincorporated in the 1840s as the economy finally began to revive again. But it would not revive with shipbuilding, though we did start building ships again. It revived again because of oystering. And the ships that we were building beginning in the 1840s were first and foremost for oystermen, for either catching the oysters, hence the log canoes, or for transporting the oysters. Vessels like the schooners and the bug-eye that you see in this photograph, where they're drying their sails, something that you needed to do in the days of cotton sails after every rainstorm, or they rotted. Now, one last detail about shipbuilding. Log canoes made sense, as I said, when labor was scarce, there weren't a lot of folks, and materials were plentiful. Because to make ship plank, you needed to pit saw timbers. Pit sawing is basically you dig a 6-foot pit, you roll a log over it, and then you use a 2-man saw. The master up top guiding the saw down to make a straight cut, the apprentice down getting it in the pit, getting his face full of sawdust, and pulling the tiller down for that stroke. But you all probably know that if you dig a 6-foot pit around here, you probably end up with a swimming pool. So they had to put the logs up on trestles, on 6-foot trestles. More labor and lots of labor. But beginning in about 1865, we finally got a steam sawmill around here in Tunis Mills. It was the W.W. Tunis Mill, which finally had carriages that could take timbers of any length. Now, house carpenters can use shorter lengths. You can build a house with 10, 20-foot timbers. But for a ship, you want long lengths. It makes for a stronger ship if you've got continuous lengths of planking that go forward and aft along the hull. You don't want short planks. That makes for a weak and leaky vessel. Well, W.W. Tunis could saw timbers of any length, therefore revolutionizing shipbuilding in this region and ultimately spelling the end of widespread log building for boats in this area. Taking you back a little bit, this is a mid-18th century, still in the colonial period, map of Virginia and Maryland. And what I love about this is, well, a few things. One, the detail on the left shows that first Talbot County town. You see it there at the mouth of the Treadhaven, where the Treadhaven meets the Chop Tank, and it is labeled, if you can't read it, Williamstadt, which doesn't sound at all like Oxford. In one of the reestablishments of the town, it got named Williamstadt for King William, as in William and Mary, but that name didn't get used more than 10 years before they reverted to Oxford. Nevertheless, this map maker hadn't gotten the word, and in 1752, when he produced this, he still labeled it Williamstadt, because the way you produced a map in the 18th century was you found an older map and you copied it. And therefore, all the errors that appeared in the earlier map get faithfully reproduced in the subsequent maps. But one thing that Emmanuel Bowen does in this map is he shows the settlement patterns. There are these lines of dots representing plantations and houses up and down the various rivers on both shores of the Chesapeake, reflecting the settlement patterns. Where did we settle? On the shoreline. How did we get from place to place? By water. We were shaped by water. And all those settlements along the shoreline were in fact growing tobacco, at least in the 18th century. We see a transition because the soils in the eastern shore aren't as rich as those on the western shore. We see a transition toward grain farming by the time of the American Revolution. But in the colonial period, both shores of Maryland are growing extensive amounts of tobacco, Talbot County included. And all that tobacco is going through various ports of entry and ports of departure, various locations, towns where there are customs houses, among which is, of course, Oxford. In 1747, Oxford has a warehouse established for tobacco. You collect all the tobacco at the warehouse, you tax it, and then you load it on, onto ships when the ships finally show up. We see Oxfordians making money doing this, notably the personage of Robert Morris, not the signer of the Declaration, but his father, for whom the inn is named, who is a factor, a dealer for the Scottish Foster Cunliffe firm, buying tobacco on credit, shipping it over to Great Britain. He's a prosperous individual, though killed in 1750. One of his vessels shows up on the river. He rows out to meet it. They fire a salute to meet him, and he gets hit by the wadding. So the wound ultimately kills him. He is importing also slaves. Yes, there is actually direct importation of black Africans from Africa to Oxford in the 18th century. We have accounts of this in 1763, in 1771, and in 1772, leading up to the time of the American Revolution. Oxford is importing slaves directly, some of them too from the Caribbean, such as Barbados, but several of those directly from Africa. Oxford is a port of entry, including that famous triangle trade that included the importation of slaves to this area. Now, the water is a highway, but those of us who go about by foot or bicycle or car know that the water is also a barrier. And so, we need to cross it. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's the early 1707 Plat of Oxford, which helpfully includes not just the lots of Oxford as it was laid out in 1707, but also that wonderful drawing of a period sloop, one of the great impressions that we have from a vessel of the Chesapeake in that day, such as were trading to this area and, in fact, being built in this area. But on to the ferries. We see ferries because we need to get across the water too at various places. The surviving one you know well as the Oxford Bellevue Ferry, dating to 1683. We don't know how it was propelled. Could have been propelled like this one to Y Island, simply rowed across. Well, the Tread Avon's fairly broad there. Perhaps some of the narrower ferries, like the one at Skipton Creek, at Miles River Bridge, at Grace's Creek, or Broad Creek, at Barker's Landing, crossing the Choptank. There were a whole bunch of them along the Choptank. At Dover, what you now know as Dover Bridge, Jamaica Point, Chancellor's Point, and Ferry Point, where the Cambridge Bridge is. All these ferry locations. Well, surely those broader crossings likely weren't entirely rowed, except on very calm days. They did build sail ferries, and likely made sense for the wider ferries. This is a sail ferry on a short crossing, the one at Y Narrows, now spanned by a bridge. Oxford's ferry was suspended during the American Revolution. Why? Well, Oxford went through a similar decline to St. Michael's. St. Michael's went into decline when shipbuilding plummeted. Oxford went into decline with American independence, because without the tobacco trade to England, there was no longer the need for a customs house. The customs house closes, and the reason for there being a town in Oxford declines. Oxford depopulates, and the ferry ceases to operate for quite a number of years. It's reestablished finally in 1837, only with a county subsidy, an annual subsidy to make sure that it continues to run. And then ultimately they go from sail-powered to steam-powered to motor-powered. Some of you may remember the old three-car Tread Avon that functioned across there until 1973. Oxford, like St. Michael's, would go through an evolution from being a center of trade to being a center of seafood. Oystering, certainly, but also becoming an early center of the hard crab trade with lots of packing houses on its shores. And building boat yards as well. The site of the Oxford Boat Yard was first the shipbuilding yard of Benson and Bateman through the 19th century. Later became the Oxford Shipyards, ultimately Oxford Boat Yard, which would, this is a scene on the eve of World War II. During World War II, would become a center for military shipbuilding, contracts to serve the United States, building plane rearming boats and aircraft personnel rescue boats and plane rearming boats that carried torpedoes and the like, all produced for wartime contracts in Oxford. Oxford reinvented itself first from being a trade center to being a seafood center, from being a seafood center now to being a center for yachting, for recreational boating. It's a remarkable story of reinvention for these small towns that never had enough to be able to diversify and have all their economic eggs in one proverbial basket. All of those entirely reliant on the town's relationship with the water. The water shapes who we are. Even Easton. Well, Easton. Why is Easton founded where it is? Well, Easton is built around the courthouse, which is put in a compromised location. The Lloyd family, who hosted the first court back in 1662, desperately wanted the court, the seat of Talbot County, to be located near their home on the Wye River, perhaps near Wye Town, the Y Town farm there, right by Y House. But when Queen Anne's County was cut off as a separate county, Talbot County lost a lot of its territory, and that didn't make sense for the location of the county seat. It was off to one corner of the county. And so instead, and Oxford desperately wanted it. Oxford was the largest town. The compromise location was Easton. What was in Easton? Not much. A tired old tobacco field owned by a man by the name of Armstrong. And he was glad to sell this worn-out tobacco field for the site of the courthouse, which happened to be close to a bridge over Pitts Bridge. That's roughly up where the Eastern Utilities power plant is, and it's sort of a crossroads of the county. So a good central location that is served by roads. The water, navigable water anyway, is nearly a mile away from this courthouse location. Where is it? Easton Point. And Easton Point nevertheless serves as a vital trade connection for Talbot County. Starting out sort of as mixed use, as residential and industrial, becoming, as the 20th century wore on, almost entirely industrial. Here you see it in 1877 with Robert B. Dixon's Coal and Lumber Company. There was an ice house there. There was later on petroleum plant or petroleum depot. Lots of point for importation, and as you see in the center of this image, steamboats. This was Easton's steamboat connection. The steamboats, as they developed, Baltimore being the hub for steamboating on the upper part of the Chesapeake Bay and frankly clear down to the Rappahannock River and the Potomac. Baltimore was the hub for steamboating. All the steamboat lines, virtually all the steamboat lines, radiated out of Baltimore. Much like all roads lead to Rome, all steamboat routes lead to Baltimore in the upper Chesapeake Bay, including those that came to the eastern shore. And yes, there were routes to the Miles River, but they arrived late and left early. The durable routes, starting as early as 1819, came up the Choptank River, branched off onto the Tread Avenue, branched off even onto the Tuckahoe River, going clear up. Steamboats went clear up to Hillsborough. It's hard to imagine getting a steamboat up those narrow and winding waterways, but they did it and served landings all along the way. Well, one of the landings that they served was Easton Point. Served in the later years with luxurious steamboats like the steamboats Talbot and Dorchester, built for the Maryland Steamboat. For the Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic Steamboat Company that served these wharves. This is the central saloon around it's sort of a two-deck or two-story space in the center of the steamboat, around which all of the staterooms entered. Each of the staterooms had a water view, a window that opened out for fresh air, but the doors opened into this central space. Rather luxurious way to travel. These boats were, you see this, actually, this is a builder's photograph from Baltimore before the completion of the vessel, and you can see it's fitted out rather luxuriously. It was a good way to travel, and people did travel this way. The steamboats carried both freight on the lower deck, on the main deck, and passengers on the upper deck. And these two steamboats, Talbot and Dorchester, did serve among other places Easton Point. Easton Point, as you know, is good deep water there, although you've got to navigate carefully. My grandfather, who was a native of Easton, told me that one of those steamers, he couldn't remember which one it was because they were truly identical except the names painted on the side, and served this route in alternation. One of them ran aground just across from Easton Point, off of what now would be Easton Village, Fort Stokes. There it sat stuck for the night, waiting until the next high tide the following morning. Well, the crew went ashore into Easton to get dinner, and my grandfather and 3 other teenage boys decided that they had free rein of the boat and thoroughly explored this. Luxurious travel. The water connected them, connected us through the steamboats to Baltimore. And if there's one village in Talbot County that is that is entirely built on their connection to steamboats and to steam in general, it is the village of Claiborne, which grew up, particularly what we call New Claiborne, the side toward Claiborne Cove, when the railroad reached it in 1890. That railroad, which ultimately would be taken over by that Baltimore, Chesapeake, and Atlantic Railway Company, would bring steamboats from Baltimore, roughly a 3-hour trip from Baltimore to Claiborne, then connect up with the railroad, and another 3-hour trip, depending on whether you took the express or the local, would carry you clear across the peninsula, through Easton, through Hurlock, and on over to Ocean City. Claiborne, the train did arrive fairly late there, 1890, and service tapered off in the 1930s. The Depression years were hard on both the steamboats and the railroads around here, so that passenger service in particular tailed off and freight declined along this route. Ultimately, the building that you see the steamboat tied up to would be dismantled in 1933 and rebuilt for a seafood packing house in St. Michael's. It survives today as Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum's small boat shed. Tillman, I have Tillman Islanders here, so I can't neglect that village. Tillman is later to be settled, and when it does grow up, so it doesn't have that early shipbuilding. It does have later boat building, and boat building to serve the oyster industry. Boat building to produce boats like these skipjacks that then served the watermen on Knapp's Narrows. That's the skipjack Reliance, which is no longer with us, and the skipjack on the right, the E.C. Collier, now built into the oystering exhibit at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. We've seen a decline in these skipjacks. These, of course, were the last generation of oyster dredging vessels, preceded by oyster sloops, by bug-eyes, by pungies, even by schooners. But the skipjacks were cheaper to build and did the job well enough that they ultimately came to dominate the oyster trade, including the trade at the fishery at Tillman. Tillman grows up then in the 19th century as a waterman's community, but not only seafood harvesting, but seafood packing as well, in what became the largest seafood packing company in the county, the Tillman Packing Company, locally owned until it sold out to the Mott Food Company, which then suddenly and precipitously closed it in 1975. There were a couple of fires there. Nothing at all remains of the Tillman Packing Company, except the artificial island that they built for their plant. Now is the clubhouse for the Tillman on Chesapeake community. St. Michael's, as I mentioned, starts as the shipbuilding town, then grows up as the seafood town in the 19th century. All of the houses that you see virtually all of the houses that you see in the historic district there were built on money made in the oyster trade. Oysters that were harvested by boats like these, the oystermen's tonging canoes these are lined up along the shoreline today where the Patriot ties up. And that funny little cupolaed building to the center right of the picture is where the crab claw stands today. Well, at first, all of these oysters, and the Miles River produced a lot of oysters in the day, were simply shipped out. These are the oystermen taking their boats out to the buy boat. Now, some of you will know, I know what a buy boat looks like, and that doesn't look like a buy boat. Well, the buy boat, of course, is the function, and before we had motor buy boats, we had schooner buy boats, we had sailing buy boats, and so here the schooner Kate McNamara is in fact buying the oysters from the oystermen and carrying them over to the seafood packing houses, where the seafood packing industry really started in Baltimore during the Civil War, even a few years before the Civil War, but really grows up during the Civil War, the canning industry there, to feed the Union Army. St. Michael's residents eventually figure out that they can make a lot more money by packing the oysters themselves. And so they begin to do so and build a series of oyster packing houses and sell their then processed, their packed seafood for greater money that then results in the construction of some of those nicer houses in St. Michael's. This is on Navy Point, on what is today the grounds of the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. If you know those grounds, this would be the lighthouse. You'd be standing, the photographer is standing on the ice, the harbor is frozen, and the lighthouse site is just off to the left of this photograph. This is Navy Point from the air, now moving into the 20th century. That cute little cupola building where the crab claw stands has been replaced by big oil tanks. They didn't last long. And no, there is not very much oil pollution in the soil. We've checked. This point of land is all artificial land. That's not a natural shoreline. That whole point of land was simply the shallow waters of the harbor. But as the seafood packing companies grew and they needed to expand, they used the byproduct of the oyster industry, which is the shell, and they dumped it overboard. And they used it to create artificial land, and then they built on top of it. The same thing happened down in Tillman with the Tillman Packing Company. That Tillman on Chesapeake clubhouse is built on artificial land, which is built on discarded oyster shells. In St. Michael's, Navy Point is all built on discarded oyster shells. And every time they wanted to expand again, they simply filled in more of the harbor with more oyster shells. By the time you see this picture, we've got 4 different seafood packing companies operating in the town. On the left with the brick chimney, the St. Michael's Packing Company. Next to them, the Harrison and Jarboe Company, which that's just one of 5 or 6 plants they owned around the county and one even outside of the county. Then the T-shaped building that you see in there is Colburn and Jewett. I'll get to their story. And on the far right side is the Calk and McCready. 4 different seafood packing houses on the same point of land. By 1910, virtually every household in St. Michael's has one member of the household who is either harvesting oysters or working in the seafood packing houses, shucking oysters, picking crabs, contributing in some way. The town is shaped by this. The Colburn and Jewett plant is an extraordinary story. And this is an artist scene, Ruth Starr Rose, Talbot County artist from the 1930s, her impression of crab pickers in St. Michael's. Well, the artist is white, but she was picking subjects of African Americans, of African American culture. And all the crab pickers, one, they're all women, and they're all black. And they're working in the black-owned seafood packing house of Colburn and Jewett. It's sort of an extraordinary story that in 1902, 2 black entrepreneurs, having learned the oyster trade in St. Michael's, figured out that they could make a lot more money if they were the owners and not simply employees, somehow managed to get somebody to sell the land to them. It was the old miller who was moving out of town, who was moving up to New York, and he sold the land to them. This was often a barrier to entry in business for African Americans in this day. A few years later, Maryland would be enacting the first of the Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation in Maryland communities. Not only that, but they managed to get a bank loan from their hometown of Crisfield, undersigned by a member of the Tawes family, an ancestor of the later governor of Maryland. Got both the land and the capital to be able to own what later became the largest seafood packing house in St. Michael's, employing 100 year-round employees. And choosing, unlike the earlier oyster houses, which would pack oysters in the winter and switch over to canning fruits and vegetables in the summer, they chose, rather than to go to fruits and vegetables, to pack what in the early 20th century was a new product, crabs. Before then, without artificial ice making and artificial refrigeration, you couldn't keep crabs. They spoiled too quickly. They were a warm weather product. Oysters come out of cold water during the colder months. We don't have to worry about the preservation of them as much. But crabs, you need that artificial ice making, artificial refrigeration. That technology comes around in the 1890s, and so this this new trade of crab picking, now we don't just eat crabs locally, but we can ship them to much farther markets, and we can employ people in them. Colburn and Jewett do that. The firm ultimately, Colburn sells out. Jewett retires, and his son, Elwood Jewett, who you see here in this picture, takes over. It becomes a successful two-generation business. Jewett, the father, Frederick Jewett, the father, was really a rather clever businessman. He was kind of the charismatic front person. I think Colburn was the quieter Methodist minister who kept the trains running on time in the business. But Frederick Jewett, among other things, had a stroke of marketing genius. He said, rather than just picking all the crab meat and putting it into the pound container and selling all that crab meat together, you know, the claw meat, we'll still pack that, or we'll call that regular crab meat, but we can grade the crab meat. We can get the ladies to separate out the crab meat. The claw meat, it's kind of gray and brown. It's not as pretty. We're going to separate out claw meat as a lower grade. And then all that shredded up body meat, we're going to call that special. It's just body meat. The larger pieces we'll call back fin. And then when it comes out in particularly big pieces, we're going to label that as lump. These 5 grades: regular, claw, special, back fin, and lump. And when you go, devised by Frederick Jewett, when you go to the grocery store, the seafood market today, how are you buying crab meat? It is labeled with those same grades. Although now they call lump jumbo lump. It's like inflation. Always reliant on the water. First in St. Michael's for shipbuilding, then for harvesting these waters for seafood packing. And then in the final years, St. Michael's seafood industry's decline in the post-World War II years, particularly the 1960s. We see the onset of oyster diseases, and there were a series of bad crab harvests in the 1960s, 3 years running. And Jewett sees the writing on the wall. He sells out. Others close their businesses. Within a few years, within less than 10 years' time, all of the seafood packing houses in St. Michael's closed their doors. The same thing is happening elsewhere in the county, in Oxford and in Tillman. So what do we turn to? Well, part of the story here is that with all the unemployment that resulted from the loss of these seafood packing houses, we were looking for what was next in Talbot County. Zoning was a new concept in Talbot County. The idea that you needed permission to build a plant here or there, that this was set aside for housing and that was set aside for industry and this is set aside for commerce. Well, we had an oil company come and explore the possibility of building an oil refinery. And the people of Bay 100, where there was lots of unemployment, were actually pretty enthusiastic about this idea. It was to go in on the shores of Claiborne Cove. But the Talbot County Commission at that time would not give them the zoning change that they needed to build industry in Claiborne. Ultimately, they built instead down in Yorktown. The oil refinery is still down there. And the people of Bay 100 said, well, if you're not going to give us those good paying jobs, the people in downwind Talbot County were not so enthusiastic about the oil refinery. If you're not going to give us those good paying jobs, what are you going to do? And the answer was, we're going to create a lower impact industry. We're going to create a tourism industry to create those jobs instead. And so in 1965, they opened the doors for Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum and located it in St. Michael's. The following year, Bill Jones, seeing a good thing, opened a seafood packing house and named it the Crab Claw. 3 years later, a local farmer, Jim Hikus, brought a charter boat up from the Florida Keys and named it the Patriot and began giving narrated cruises on the Miles River. Within a few years, we saw the kernel of a new tourism and hospitality trade, which has now boomed since then. When I came, at that time, there was not a single business downtown that was catering to tourists. There were 2 banks, there were 2 hardware stores, there was an Acme Market. all of that has changed around the tourism industry. And St. Michael's, just as Oxford reinvented itself as a recreational boating center, St. Michael's reinvented itself as a tourism and hospitality center and managed to survive, still with all of its economic eggs in one basket. Still, and as you know, that tourism industry still reliant on the water. We have always been reliant on the water. We have always been dependent on our relationship to the water. And so we continue today. We are fully reliant on our relationship to the waters of Talbot County.
Could I have a question? Your next lecture
Just so everybody,
can be on the warming trends right now, talking about water. Because when I go to St. Michael's, all I hear about the high tides. Has that affected your place that much as right now?
So the question is about rising waters and how it is impacting us in St. Michael's and frankly elsewhere in Talbot County. And the answer is yes, it absolutely is impacting us. We are experiencing what some will call nuisance flooding, although when it gets high enough that the museum has to close its doors, when it gets high enough that the Patriot cannot take passengers because the water is over the wharves, when it gets high enough that the Crab Claw cannot do business because the lower floor is completely flooded. And not just the Crab Claw, but other restaurants in St. Michael's are experiencing flooding all too frequently. A few years ago, Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum had to cancel its Oyster Fest because of inundation from a high tide associated with a low pressure system. All the low-lying areas, Oxford is experiencing this, Tillman is experiencing this. We absolutely are, and we are looking at ways. We are looking at ways of how do we guarantee that evacuation routes, think the Oxford Causeway, are above water. Even where Route 33 crosses the North Fork of the Tread Avon River is subject on extreme tides to lane closures because of flooding. How are we going to make sure? Well, we're going to have to raise those road beds in order to get people safely out of the way. In some places, we probably will have to retreat from the water. In other places, we will elevate buildings. We've been doing that in a number of places in St. Michael's, elevating buildings. The museum's newest building is built at an elevation of 9 feet above the 1,000-year flood or the 0.2% flood. It's 0.1% flood. We are finding ways of dealing with this. Where can the water go? Oxford has been doing a program to create places for water to go so that it doesn't go to houses. There's more work to be done with that, but that is, as you point out, will be our generational challenge, is dealing with rising waters. And we will be learning from those to our south, because Dorchester County has this problem to an even greater severity than Talbot County does, even more low-lying land.
On that point, the Chesapeake Bay Environmental Center up in Graysonville, right now there are times you better be careful because you may not get back out again.
Yeah, we're seeing this all over again. Evacuation routes for in the face of these extraordinary tides. Just in January, we saw one of these extraordinary tides. Back in November, we saw one of these extraordinary tides. And it is affecting business. It is affecting lives in Talbot County. Yes.
It's good to hear good old days that you've talked about this evening. It's been beautiful. Thank you.
we have plenty of time for questions, so please ask away.
I'm curious, the oil tanks that you showed early on, 1929 and earlier, how did the oil get here? Was it brought in by rail?
The oil at these waterfront locations at Easton Point and at St. Michael's was brought in by boat, was brought in by not what you might think of today as tankers, but as by motor vessels that did have tanks built into them. There were vessels that delivered particularly heating oil, but in the day also gasoline and kerosene and other petroleum products. And it is still true today. You might remember a few years ago, one of the railroad companies, CSX, was telling that they could move 1 ton of freight 1 mile on this much fuel, much more efficient than trucks.
Yes.
Well, the secret is, of course, that moving by tug and barge is even cheaper than moving it by railroad. And even today, so much of our petroleum moves up and down the coast and across Chesapeake Bay by tug and barge. And Easton Point, until recently, was one of those receiving sites for heating oil. Most of the heating oil for Washington arrived by tug and barge with the Stewart Transportation Company. It absolutely was moving by water, and still is to some extent. Just more centralized than it was in the days when you saw those oil tanks.
Pete, I want to just ask you to clarify, what we're looking at there, that peninsula where the museum is, that's reclaimed land that was built on oyster shell?
All of that. Basically, if you went through the museum's old entrance, through that sort of pilot house looking building, once you stepped out of that building, you were standing on artificial land. From there on out, all of the museum's shipyard, the ground where the lighthouse now stands, which used to be Colburn and Jewett, on over to where our small boat shed stands and at Play on the Bay, all of that is built up on oyster shells. When we had to drive the pilings to form the foundation for the At Play on the Bay building, that building opened in 2005, so we probably did the test borings in 2002 or 2003. I think they found that, of course, there's some of that stack of oyster shells above the low tide line, but it also filled in some water and probably compressed some sediments underneath. And in some places, that accumulation of oyster shells was as thick as 14 or 16 feet.
Wow.
It's a lot of oyster shells. And all those oysters would have been shucked right there.
I was just down in Chrisfield, and Chrisfield, same thing. You know, the whole town was built on oysters.
Chrisfield is really even more extreme than any place around Talbot County, having been built on oyster shells. Yes, absolutely.
Can you say something about the markets when the St. Michael's or Tillman hacking started? Where were the markets? How did so sort of from the distribution to the retail?
Once railroads arrived in St. Michael's, and Oxford for that matter, a lot of the oyster product, a lot of the packed oysters went by railroad car. The original refrigerated railroad car worked so long as the car was moving. It was a box in the center, which was where you put all the cans of oysters in boxes, in ice and so forth. And there was a container at the front end of the car that was filled with ice and with open slats. And as you moved the railroad car, air would move through that ice, cool down, and blow then cold air across the oysters or the other refrigerated product. And so that was being done, shipping oysters out of St. Michael's, out of Oxford. And of course, when you're moving by railroad car, you're not going across the bay to Baltimore. You're going up the peninsula. You're going up toward Wilmington and Philadelphia. And so a lot of oysters did, in fact, get up to big city markets in Philadelphia and New York. But many more actually got sent out to, again by railroad line, out west to the cities of the great western, the great American West, cities as far west as Pittsburgh and Cleveland. This is an Eastern Shore perspective, you understand. And Chicago and St. Louis and Minneapolis. We have records of trade relationships of Chesapeake packers who are shipping oysters to all of those cities, and Chesapeake oysters getting even as far as the mining camps of Colorado. So particularly through the industrial cities of the upper Midwest, but also to the big cities of the Northeast, to Philadelphia, New York. Don't have records of Boston, but they were certainly eating a lot of oysters up there as well.
Can you speak a little bit to the archives that are available at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, especially in your area, and what the public might be able to access there?
Thank you, Dana. So, Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, there is, of course, what you can see as a daily visitor in our exhibitions, but Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum has also been collecting, like any museum, not as much so as the Smithsonian. There's a fraction of 1% on exhibit. We might have 10% on exhibition, but a considerable archive of maybe as many as 65 or 70,000 photographs, historic photographs, manuscripts, hundreds of feet of manuscripts of some of these oyster packing companies, yacht design firms, and naval architects, various businesses that had one thing or another to do with either business on the bay or recreation on the bay, are all accessible. We are accessible mostly by appointment. We want to make sure that there's a staff member ready to serve you. So do look us up online. There's information there about what you can research in advance on our website. You can search our whole collection there, and we're working on getting digital images of all that online as well. But then, if that sparks your interest and you need to come see a collection in person, we do have a good facility to be able to do that as well. Thank you, Dana. In the back.
As a follow-on, you did an extensive oral history archive in conjunction with an exhibit surrounding the Dove, I think 2 years back now.
Yes.
Those materials seem like they would be already digitized and available to those of us out in the...
That is correct. We've collected oral histories since the 1980s, recordings, recorded interviews, and many of them have been done as discrete projects. The most recent discrete project being those who constructed the Maryland Dove back in the 1970s. But we've also done foodways on skipjacks, interviewing captains and crews about food eaten on skipjacks, which gets into other things. We interviewed women in the crab picking industry back in the late 90s and early 2000s, at a time when a lot of women were leaving, watermen's wives in particular, were leaving the seafood packing industry and were being replaced by migrant workers from Mexico and from Central America. And a lot of seafood packing businesses were closing. So we've done a lot of these sort of discrete groups of interviews, in addition to kind of reacting to that opportunity when somebody tells us, you've got to get this guy's story. Thank you. And so we have digitized audio of those interviews. We also, in most cases, have transcripts, which make those things more accessible. You don't have to listen to a whole interview. You can scan through. You can even do a word search through a transcript and look for those subjects that spark your interest.
You briefly mentioned the creation of the museum.
Yes.
Never known. Was it created by the county government? How did
It,
speak briefly about that?
yeah, the creation of Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum was certainly a project of a number of leading citizens of the county who were looking to do this. It was not a county government project, but it was done under the auspices of what is now called the Talbot Historical Society. And the board of Talbot Historical Society decided at the time that the maritime story here was a big enough story that it shouldn't just be a section or a department of the County Historical Society. It merited being its own museum. And so for the first 3 years, until 1968, when it was independently incorporated, the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum was a project of the Historical Society. Ultimately became independent, and was led by persons who were involved in then both of those organizations. And they had the vision. It's kind of extraordinary. They chose not to call it the Talbot County Maritime Museum. They chose a bay-wide scope and said, you know, there's a big story to tell here. And I'm grateful that they did.
Yes.
Bravo.
John, did you have something?
Several weeks ago, I was with my daughter. I visited the National Cathedral and met the dean of the cathedral, whose name is Hollerith. And I understood by meeting him several other times, he used to visit his family's home in Oxford. And I would like to know, because I did meet with Norm Plummer, to find out where is the Hollerith collection and what is in it. I gather the collection is basically photographs of the bay.
Yes.
Christina, I didn't know anything that I didn't know that it existed until I met the dean of National Cathedral, which is kind of an interesting way to.
So Herman Hollerith Sr. was a very successful businessman. He invented the punch card machine that was used for the 1890 census, and he ultimately sold out to a firm that merged and became IBM. So he was Washington based, but he also had a summer place on the shores of Mobjack Bay, and so and his son Herman Hollerith Jr. had access to really great photographic equipment and took wonderful photographs. He had a good eye in addition to having good equipment, and took photographs of steamboating. He, in fact, got involved as some of the steamboat companies were failing after World War I. They started a company to restore service to Mobjack Bay. In that case, it was not out of Baltimore, but out of Norfolk. And so there's lots of photos of steamboating. There's lots of photos of the fishery. There's lots of photos of recreational boating at their home named Brighton down on the shores of one of the tributaries of Mobjack Bay. And this photo archive, which actually includes some early motion picture, he did some early safety film, 16 millimeter motion picture, not the scrawny little 8 millimeter stuff, but good 16 millimeter black and white safety film. So you can see steamboats underway, and and lots of sailing scenes, lots and lots and lots of sailing scenes. But all of that whole archive, which comprises maybe 2,000 or more images, is part of the archive at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum and is available. That is one piece that actually we are recataloging right now, and we are working on getting that online so that too can be searched in our online, and we are at the same time we are digitizing it. So not only will you be able to search it, but you'll be able to see it just in our online. Some of it is already there. Some of it is already online. That it is a really wonderful collection. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm kind of a newcomer. I've only been here 17 years, so I first fought my way through Chesapeake by Michener. And in that book, they were saying, the novel, but people could sail to the Quaker establishment in Easton. Was that, that bypasses there, you can't get through anymore, but was there enough water, do you think, or do you know of?
So yeah, there are certainly accounts of George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, visiting the Third Haven Friends Meeting House here. Then it was outside of Easton. Now it is inside Easton, of course.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it predates Easton. and yes, coming up the Treadhaven River. We don't know precisely how far they were able to navigate. We presume that the paper mill branch of the Treadhaven River was deeper, was probably navigable higher than it is today. And particularly when they took to small boats, they probably could get fairly close to it. Where did they land? We don't have that information, but there is a great account of the Treadhaven being full of boats, so full of boats on his visit, likened to the Thames in London. Perhaps overstatement, but a wonderful story. I'll take one more. John, go ahead.
I'm curious, tin cans, when did they come in? Were the early were they here early enough for the packing?
So the technology of tin cans, we see early canning is all done in jars, in glass, but by the time of the Civil War, we're seeing it done in tin. The earliest tins are hand formed. They are rectangular, not round. They are hand soldered. Do you know what the ingredients of solder include? No. Yes, lead. These products tended to have a relatively short shelf life. You don't want it soaking in the lead solder for too terribly long. But ultimately, after the Civil War, we're seeing round cans. A lot of oysters being cooked in the canned for food preservation, so that for their shipment, so that it doesn't have to be iced down and shipped fresh. That is an industry that really grows up in Baltimore during the Civil War, as I said, to feed the Union Army. And Baltimore ultimately really becomes, if you will, vertically integrated in that industry. You get Maryland Steel Company, which later becomes Bethlehem Steel Company, producing the steel and specifically producing the tin plate. Then it goes over to some waterfront companies in the Canton neighborhood, Independent Can, National Can, a whole series of a Continental Can, who are forming up the cans. Baltimore lithographers are putting the labels on them. And then waterfront packing houses in Baltimore are filling the cans with the product. So all of those stages all happen in Baltimore. And yes, the schooners arrive with empty tin cans in places like St. Michael's and Oxford for our seafood products as well. It's very much a local industry.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
I want to thank Pete very much for coming down. We really appreciate him coming out, and this has been a wonderful talk. I want to remind everybody this program was recorded with the new AV system that we have, so we'll have this program up on our YouTube channel. If you know anybody who missed the program, we should be able to provide that probably starting in a few days, but we'll be able to get that out to everybody. So again, she'll put it on our Facebook page. So we appreciate you coming out tonight. So thank you. Thank you.
I will.
I
Yes, I will. See you.
You know, they talk about the crabs. Yes. You know, when I showed you the old, yes, you know, when the Jones bought that property was owned, Dodson sold it to Jones in 58, but then he bought it, Dodson bought it